Chapter 11, Madame du Château. Intrigues of purely material nature, such as many of those we have touched upon, provided occasional distractions and served as interludes in the drama of Napoleon's career. But there was a side to his character which demanded satisfaction less gross than was afforded by a venal and transient connection. There was a fund of unsuspected melancholy in his nature, longing for solitude in the midst of the crowd, with one beloved companionship, a craving for sentimental affection which increased as he grew older, and as his opportunities for mere sensual gratification multiplied, while at the same time his lofty destiny raised him more and more above his fellows to heights of isolated greatness. The dawn of such a sentiment may be traced towards the close of the consulate. From that period onward, it gradually developed. It had little in common with the tempest of youthful passion evoked by Josephine, but its periodic ebullition shows Napoleon as a being whose stormy soul, ever athirst for the unknown, cherished a dream of happiness side by side with dreams of ambition, while this sentiment was as yet vague and confused. Possession, which he had ardently desired, the more ardently in proportion to the obstacles that intervened, had the immediate effect of suppressing desire, for reality fell short of the anticipation of his senses, but these in their turn were chastened and spiritualized. Physical possession ceased to be the sole object of his thoughts, and in this phase of his passion we recognize a new Napoleon, differing altogether from him whose material aspirations sought satisfaction in the veiled visitors of the secret staircase, a Napoleon full of delicate sentiment, whose thoughts found utterance in language worthy of a hero of Estrella. Such an aspect of his character is, of course, an unfamiliar one, and one which we should hesitate to attribute to him without abundant evidence of the most precise and authentic nature, but supported by such evidences in connection with the later period of his life, we may fairly apply the inductive method to earlier episodes and confidently interpret indications which appear insignificant at the first glance. It is obvious that we can hardly expect to find direct proofs in this connection, and the difficulties of investigation are great. The women to whom Napoleon revealed this phase of his character were not eager to tell the story of their conquest. They were rather careful to destroy every trace that might betray them. They had husbands to consider, reputations to protect. Their descendants have carefully guarded their secrets. Those indiscreet enough to babble of the romance suppressed the real names of the characters, and even after the lapse of a century, it would not be well to lift the slight veil that shrouds them, nor can we be certain that this veil always conceals the same woman. Raising it, we should perhaps discover several where we looked for one. In one instance, however, we are able to trace an identity of many physical and mental features throughout. There are characteristic facts which scarcely allow of misconception, especially when the impression of a certain face has been clearly and indelibly impressed on one's mind from childhood. But I'm no longer dealing with documents here, and can only proceed with the utmost caution, even at the risk of seeming obscure. I must leave many details in the shade. Among the ladies of the consular court there was a young woman of 20, married to a man 30 years her senior. The husband, a man of the highest character and the most indefatigable industry, who had served the state with credit in a variety of capacities, was one of those admirable public servants who, under the old regime, were made heads of departments, and under the new directors general, he had particularly distinguished himself in a special matter of great importance in its bearing on national finance, and had himself organized a department over which he presided to such good purpose that its present administration is based upon his precepts and traditions. His wife was charming, a creature all grace and sweetness, with a pretty face, beautiful teeth, and abundant fair hair. Her nose was aquiline, and though somewhat too long, delicately arched and full of character. Her foot was very small, her hand perfectly modeled, her features were irregular, but her smile was bewitching, and combined with the long glances of a pair of deep blue eyes gave an expression of peculiar harmony to her face. Those blue eyes indeed conveyed any sentiment their mistress chose to affect, and limpid as they were, they lacked sincerity, but it needed a woman and a rival to discover this. Their owner danced and sang exquisitely, played the harp, could read or listen with equal grace, and at this time made no great display of the remarkable intellectual powers she afterwards developed. She was amply endowed with strength of will, ambition, and worldly acuteness, and was troubled by few scruples when her interests were at stake, but this hardness of character was veiled by a grace and distinction no less remarkable than her beauty, and though of middle-class origin, she excelled many of the greater ladies of her day in the perfect courtesy of her manners, the elegance of toilettes, and the stately dignity of bearing proper to court etiquette. She had a natural aptitude for the graces and refinements of good society, and an instinctive knowledge of that art which, as has been truly said, may be divine, but cannot be taught. She had withal a superb and lofty air, as if her forefathers had been dukes and peers rather than provincial citizens of a very humble rank. When did Bonaparte fall in love with this young woman? Certain evidences seem to indicate Brumaire, year 12, November 1803, but the rapidity with which the preliminaries had been conducted in the case of the woman whom Josephine surprised in the orangerie at St. Cloud seem hardly to agree with this hypothesis, in spite of the additional probability it derives from the fact of a birth which took place exactly 9 months later, August 5th, 1804. True, the child then born developed no very significant traits either of mind or person, but features so characteristic as those of the Bonapartes not unfrequently pass over a generation and lay the telltale impress of their sovereign beauty on some descendant. Such was no doubt the case here, and this freak of nature, while inspiring Napoleon with doubts as to his own paternity, the child left the husband's confidence unshaken, secured the wife's safety, and after the lapse of a generation revealed a secret that had been kept with almost complete success thereto. Was this lady of St. Cloud the mysterious unknown who, towards the close of the consulate, inhabited a small house in the Allée des Veuves, to which Napoleon paid frequent secret visits? Was she the same woman to whose house in the middle of Paris he occasionally found his way alone in disguise? It's impossible to decide. The St. Cloud adventures seem to have been one of those trivial intrigues which have no sequel, but the nocturnal expeditions are very significant in the case of one who so seldom quitted the shelter of his own roof as Napoleon. They seem to point to an impetuosity by no means normal. The subject is shrouded in mystery. We cannot undertake to solve at present a mystery the chroniclers or their publishers have been careful to preserve in deference to the reputation of the woman and the susceptibilities of her descendants. But there is one point at which all evidences converge, all testimonies reinforce and corroborate one another. If material proofs are still lacking, the very strongest presumptions may at least be adduced. The emperor proceeded to Fontainebleau to receive the Pope on the pontiff's arrival from Rome for the coronation. He was attended by the court. It was soon evident that his temper had become more serene, his manner more affable. After the Pope had retired into his own apartments, he remained with the Empress, conversing with the ladies of her household. Josephine became uneasy. Her jealousy was aroused. Such proceedings seemed to her unnatural, and she suspected some hidden intrigue. Who was the offender? Whom should she accuse? At last she fixed on Madame Ney, who defended herself vigorously to Hortense, her former schoolfellow. She declared that the emperor paid her no attention whatever, that he was entirely absorbed in a lady of the household, whom Eugène de Beauharnais also greatly admired, and to whom Josephine had shown favor. In consequence, Eugène was only a blind. The lady might return his glances and seem to take pleasure in his conversation, but as a fact she was a sworn ally of the Murat's, or rather of Caroline, for it was she who was the moving spirit in such machinations. Hating her sister-in-law and always ready to annoy her, she directed this intrigue, as she afterwards directed many others. The court returned to Paris. Nothing decisive had happened so far. Napoleon was obviously in love. He had great difficulty in tearing himself away from the Empress's apartments when a certain lady was in attendance. He joined Josephine at the play if a certain lady accompanied her. He arranged parties in the smaller boxes, though he generally insisted that his family should appear at the theater instead. Josephine, yielding to her growing exasperation, attempted expostulations, which were very ill received, though gayer, franker, and more gracious in public than he had ever been. Napoleon was irritable and gloomy in private when a certain lady was not of the company, and a day passes without some outbreak from Bonaparte, writes Josephine, and always without the least cause. Life is not worth living under such conditions. The emperor had taken to playing cards in the evening, or at any rate to a pretense of playing. Every night he summoned his sister Caroline to his table, and two other court ladies, of whom the favorite was always one, holding his cards negligently and making the proposed game a mere screen for conversation. He would discourse on the various aspects of platonic and ideal affection, or deliver himself of violent tirades against jealousy and jealous women. At the other end of the room, Josephine, engaged in a dreary game of whist with certain court dignitaries, would glance sadly from time to time at the favorite table, listening eagerly to the words of the sonorous voice that penetrated to the farthest extremity of the apartment amidst the respectful silence of attentive courtiers. At a fete given to the sovereigns of the war minister in honor of the coronation, the ladies only were seated at supper. As was customary, the empress, with some of her ladies and the wives of the great crown officials, presided at the table of honor. Napoleon had refused to take his place. He passed along the room, addressing each of the ladies in turn, gay, courtly, and gracious. He served Josephine, taking a dish from one of the pages to present it to her. He wished to charm one woman only, but was anxious that the others should not perceive it. This in itself was a sign of love. After having perambulated the whole room with a word or two to every one of the ladies, he felt he had purchased the right to speak to the real object of all his gallantry. Approaching her, he began in some embarrassment by addressing her neighbor. Leaning between the two chairs, he soon drew her into conversation, anticipating her wants and handing her the dishes. She pointed out one of these contained olives. "You ought not to eat olives at night," he remarked. "They will make you ill." Then turning to her neighbor, "I see you do not eat olives. You are quite right, and doubly right not to imitate Madame du Châtel, for she is inimitable." Josephine was fully alive to all these maneuvers. If any doubt had lingered in her mind, they had been dispelled by a recent pilgrimage to Malmaison, undertaken in the depth of winter at the sudden desire of the emperor. All her arrangements had been upset by this inopportune journey, in addition to which there had been no time to heat the stoves, and the first night had been spent in veritable ice house. But Napoleon, indifferent to the cold, was not deterred from a midnight expedition through the flat corridors, as Josephine ascertained by concealing herself behind a glass door, from which hiding place, after a long spell of waiting, she surprised her husband's secret unobserved. The court returned to Malmaison after the ministerial fete, and on the following day the empress found a pretext for summoning the lady who had refused the olives. After some desultory conversation, she asked her what the emperor had said to her the night before, and finally what he had said to her neighbor. "He advised her not to eat olives at night," was the reply. "Well," retorted the empress, "while the emperor was advising your friend, he might have told her that it is ridiculous to attempt the part of a Roxolana with a nose as long as hers." Then turning over the leaves of a book upon the chimney piece, "La Duchesse de la Vallière by Madame de Genlis. This is the book," she said, "which turns the heads of all young women with fair hair and slender figures."